Tonight's topic is the changing landscape of flameworking. So we'll explore the diverse terrain of complex identities within and adjacent to contemporary flameworking. And our goal is to establish inclusive language to define the field and to discuss the future of flameworking and set intentions for collective growth. The discussion topics will include tonight, what are some of the areas of specialty that make up the landscape of contemporary flameworking? How can we define contemporary flameworking? And where do you think the field of flameworking is headed? And in what ways do you anticipate advancement in the field? So for those of you who were with us last meeting, we're going to run this the same way that we did. And for those of you who are new to us, let me just explain to you how we're going to do this. So Madeline and I are your facilitators tonight, and we will be directing traffic. And so what we will do is we'll ask a question to the group, and we'll also put that question in the chat. And then we will ask you to respond. And so we want to make room for everybody's voices. And so you have two ways to be heard. You can work the chat. And then also, if you'd like to address the group verbally, then you can use the hand raise function, and Madeline and I will call on you to address the group. So moving on, we will follow up with consolidated and edited notes from this meeting and share it to the Flame Chat Google group, which you will have been added to if you joined tonight's discussion. And as a reminder, please throw some support towards GEEX if you're able to. We really appreciate it. And that's what will enable this space to keep going and for us to continue with this type of programming. So thank you so much. And I'm going to now go back to, let's see, let's unshare the screen. There we go. All right. Thank you all. All right. So before we get going with tonight's meeting agenda, I just wanted to check in with everybody about our last meeting. So the goal of our last meeting was to identify what resources could be helpful for the community of educators and co-learners and make these resources available to everybody. And Madeline and I compiled meeting notes after the meeting and distributed them to the group. And I was just wondering if anybody had any feedback about that. Were those notes useful? Was it too much info, not enough info? Just kind of curious, because we'd like to continue to make meeting notes and distribute them. And so any kind of direction or opinion, did you use those notes? We'd love to just hear from anybody who might have some quick feedback before we get started with tonight's topics. So does anybody have anything that they would like to share from the last meeting or about the notes or the format? Did it work for you? Radio silence. Okay, so I think I'll just assume that that's a okay.
And if you have any feedback that you want to give privately or email us, like, we're super happy to have that. We just want to figure out how to compile this document to make it as helpful and useful for everyone.
Yeah, and in addition, this meeting will also be recorded, so you'll be able to access a recording of this meeting to review it too, or if for those who were in the group but unable to make the meeting for various reasons. So, okay, great. So on that note, let's go ahead and get started. Tonight's topic is the changing landscape of flameworking. And our first prompt is, I would like to know from all of you, what are some of the areas of specialties that make up the landscape of contemporary flameworking? So, a lot of times as flameworkers, we tend to identify as specialists. Maybe that's as a flame worker, but also maybe that's as a pipe maker or bead maker or sculptor or plasma artist or any of the kind of identity markers that we could use to describe what it is that we do. And so I would love to hear from you. If you would please introduce yourself to the group and let us know how you prefer to identify And I'm interested in knowing how you identify both within the glass community and then also as a representative of the glass community to the outward, more general arts community, if you participate in that. So I'll go first. My name's Amy Lemaire. For those of you I don't know, hi. And when I'm speaking with the glass community or doing any kind of activity within the glass community, I identify as a flame worker and with specialties in bead making and sculpture and fabrication. But when I am working with other types of communities, like the contemporary art world or say the jewelry world, there isn't a lot of knowledge about glass. And so I find myself just identifying as an artist, just as a sculptor. And then when there's a question about, well, what kind of sculpture do you do? Then I take that as an opportunity to share that I'm a flame worker and then educate, my audience on that. So it's really kind of like, I always feel like my identity as an artist is somewhat split depending on what group it is that I'm speaking with, whether I'm kind of in a teaching situation or in the glass community, or whether I'm sort of representing the glass community in an outward kind of way. All right, Madeline, would you please introduce yourself and share with us your thoughts about how you identify or like to identify as a flame worker?
Sure, thanks. Hey guys, my name is Madeline Rile Smith. If I don't know you, great to see you all, and thanks again for coming tonight. So yeah, I was thinking a lot about this question once we started talking about it, and I have many different kind of overlapping identities, and none of them are really like fit into one little category. Like with flameworking, I do like performance art, weird sculpture that's activated by the body, and some interactive artwork. And I also have like a line of wearables and jewelry that I use to generate income and pay the bills, although I wouldn't necessarily say that's the main thing I do with flame working. So I think I'm like sort of constantly just like experimenting and doing weird things. I'm also a teacher. And I consider myself kind of an ambassador. I try to be an ambassador to flameworking or an advocate. So in terms of like putting content out and kind of making people aware of it if they may not be. So I often think about what I do as kind of through the lens of not flame working, but I do like personally, if you ask me, like I consider myself a flame worker, and I'll self-identify to other flame workers, but kind of similar to Amy, like I would be afraid to like say to an outsider, like, oh, I'm a flame worker just for like apprehension of being like pigeonholed, which is kind of an interesting thing that like this language and itself has like these sort of loaded terms. So that's kind of like an overview of how I feel, and I'm super curious, what other people think.
Yeah, is there anybody else who would like to share? Sam, yes, please. Sam, would you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to the group?
Hi, I'm Sam. I've been a pipe maker for the last 8 years, almost 9 years now, and I find myself not necessarily identifying as a pipe maker, though I feel I am a pipe maker because I generally use the term glass maker, not even glass blower, because people outside of the industry, when you say glass blower, automatically think of something other than flame working, as well as pipes have been like taboo, though they're not so much anymore. And then in the greater art world, I've been kind of nervous to identify as a pipe maker until I kind of get to know somebody or kind of see, for lack of a better terminology, like if they're cool or not, and then I can divulge that I make pipes. But yeah, there's this kind of like limiting thing or thing that's not understood always, I feel, when I introduce myself as a flame worker or a torch worker to somebody that's not deeply into the glass world. But yeah, so that's kind of how I identify. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Sam. Sally, would you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to the group?
Hi.
Oh, I think we just lost Sally, so we'll give her a minute to call back in. And in the meantime, Mariana, hello. Would you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to the group, please?
Oh, hi, Amy. Thank you. Let's see. I'm new to this too, so I'm going to see if I can turn on my. Oh, hi. So, okay, so I can see myself. Oh, thank you for having me here. Yes. To me, this is all new because I work in with clay. I work with photo and video, but with glass, like I never even identified myself as a flame worker or a bead worker. And I usually I'll say I work in glass, and and there was a time, when I first started, maybe 15 years ago, where I felt one time I couldn't identify as a bead worker because there was like this little, I don't know, I'm not trying to be negative about it, but there was like this, like a hierarchy or, and being that I was just starting and I worked with Pyrex, and I never even worked to make a bead. So I don't even know what I would have identified myself at that time. So it's really good to be in this discussion of even identifying ourselves as, but yeah, I say so. I work with glass, and I understand about the pipes because I did that with clay. I did that with the glass, especially working with Pyrex. People would ask me, "Oh, you can just make pipes? And you can just, but you're trying to learn a technique, and yeah, that's good. But you have such a limited time and material, and at that time to pay, what it would cost. I didn't want to spend my time learning how to make a pipe when I really wanted to learn how to do a flare or a goblet bottom. But I understand that, not saying it because it was a little taboo, and now it really isn't. So it was good to hear that. And I just wanted to say that it's interesting. It's an interesting conversation. So I'm going to see, what do I identify myself as? A flame worker, a bead maker, a pipe maker, a glass worker. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Mariana, and thanks so much for joining us. Sally, did you want to say something, or I know that it cut off, so if you want to introduce yourself, then you can just raise your hand. I'm not sure if you meant to or not before.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please. Yes. Hi.
I think I have a kind of a bad connection, but I just said that I try not to identify myself. I try not to, even say glass, even say anything, just do your work and be happy with that. And yeah, I think all these categories really get in the way of things.
Oh, we lost Sally, but she'll be back, and then we'll have her tap back in because I want to hear the rest of what she's saying here. Sam, would you please unmute yourself? And it looks like you have something to say, so go ahead. Sam, are you here? Okay.
Oh, sorry, I accidentally hit it. That was my bad.
Oh, no worries. No worries. All right. Okay. So does anybody else have any thoughts about all these categories that we can use to describe kind of specialties in within flameworking? Do you think it's necessary to kind of describe yourself further, or do you prefer to just kind of not use any kind of identity markers? Oh, there's Sally. All right. Hi, Sally. Okay. Yeah, I'm curious to hear from maybe if there's anybody else in the group who maybe could speak to, say, from the scientific glassblowing community, or who maybe goes to a glass program, or has had any other experience where your identity as an artist might have prompted you to kind of self-identify in a certain way. Chris Mosley. All right, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool. So Chris Mosley, I am in, I wouldn't even say scientific. I would just say glass tech. Glass tech is kind of the category. For me, it's actually been really interesting because the last few years I've had to like actually pick my title. I was in a startup in Silicon Valley. So last year I sat down with the CEO and, he was like, what title do you want? So it's been really tough for me, I would say, because I'm stuck in between, the art world. And I feel like, with like pipes and things like that, there's kind of like someone had mentioned the hierarchy, and then when I sat down with engineers, it was a whole different ball game because I don't actually have an engineering degree. So it's hard to like say my title I picked was glass specialist. So I went from flameworking to dealing with special glass, whether it's coal bar glass or Gorilla Glass. They're glasses that like you actually can't buy anywhere. You have to be an R&D facility to be able to get this type of glass. And it's, I guess for like in my world, to me, the title matters only because I'm trying to negotiate salaries. I'm trying to be like, hey, with anything with an engineering degree or, title underneath, that's it's a significant difference between like coming in with like an art background and then being like, I'm an engineer and then being able to like really negotiate for, a different salary. So I think it's, amongst us and like regular people who come to us who might want a commission, I don't think it's necessarily like Sally said, it's a big deal. But I think when you're like in the, in the real world and you're really trying to show like your worth or your skill set and what you can do, in my world at least, it definitely matters. Because people want to hear about what you can do, what type of different types of glass you've worked with. And it's kind of been a balance, it's just kind of been like, sometimes I just like I just want to make things and just show there. But then it's also being like, this is what, like my title is. So it's kind of mixed, I feel like it's in our capitalistic society, titles and hierarchy and all that. It matters if you're really trying to like get paid to a certain extent. But I think like, as far as like our group and amongst each other, I don't see it so much as a big deal. When I talk to other glass people, I actually try to, downplay a little bit because I don't really care about like what so much of the title is, but more about like, where can we go from here? Like, how can we work together? How can we collaborate to make something cool? And that's where I like to have the conversation. But, some people want to, like whether you're hotshot guys or, you're in the, top flame, the pipe world, some people like to, play that game. So it's an interesting, I think, time for flame working because I see it changing drastically, and I can share on like, as we get down the road on these conversations where I see it going. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris, for sharing your perspective. Ben, would you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to the group?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Orozco. I am the designer and web manager for GEEX, and I definitely have a lot of different backgrounds. I think I would name myself as like an artist and designer first, just because I tend to work in illustration, sculpture, very much glass, but it can really fluctuate depending on what kind of project I'm making, since I do generally focus my glass practice more on fine art, although I did do glass or neon fabrication for a good amount of time. So neon is definitely this really fun little micro niche within this flameworking community, especially considering that a lot of the American neon techniques utilize soft glass, and it's a very rigid, very constrained and very process driven or very regiment driven. aspect of flameworking.
Great, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I find that when I work as a fabricator, kind of like to piggyback on what you and what Chris was just saying, it's helpful to be able to have some kind of some terminology to describe your areas of specialty, because it kind of helps your client trust you more. And so in those types of situations, I do find it helpful to say, yes, I'm a flame worker and I specialize in plasma, or I specialize in sculpture, and be like very specific about that. But as an artist, when I have my artist hat on, then I tend to be totally general about that, and actually not, I would say be more vague. And but one thing that I have started doing that I just want to share with the group, because maybe you have some thoughts on this or maybe you do it, is when I list the materials for a sculpture, then instead of putting glass, I put borosilicate. And that's something that I've seen some other contemporary artists that I fabricate for do. And I really like that, because just in that language, it's kind of a way of acknowledging that I'm coming from a flameworking background, because that material of borosilicate carries that history. And it's also maybe not a term that is known to a lot of people in the fine arts world. And so they might have to Google it or ask a question. And so when they do ask a question, that's an opportunity for me to kind of hop in as an educator and kind of like maybe offer a little bit of clarity or a little bit of explanation. So that's kind of like one of the things that I've done to kind of help navigate this territory, and then also kind of guide my viewer towards the type of perspective on the glass world that I'm kind of coming from as well. All right. Sally, you have something to say. Would you please unmute yourself? Oh, Sally, I think you're muted. You're muted still. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, I just have to block my picture.
Okay.
So I think that, what you were just saying, when I think of flame working or lamp working, I think of, how ancient it is. And borosilicate is a very new glass. And, like I remember going to Italy and telling people, oh yeah, I do both soft glass and borosilicate. And they're like, oh, borosilicate isn't a glass. And then when you're in the scientific glassblowing world, when quartz came to be popular, people will say, oh, quartz is not a glass, and it's interesting, to hear what you said there and how people relate to a certain type of glass, I just thought that was very interesting what you said. It might be good to write down quartz or soft glass or Moretti, or be more specific on things for people. But I look at it all as lamp working, or and actually, in the 70s it was all called glass blowing. The term lamp working didn't come in until the 80s, probably 70s, 80s. It just, before that it was all called glass blowing. You'd go to the glass shop, you'd talk to the scientific glass blower, but it was all glass blowing. So when you read old material, you'll see just the term glass blowing and not lamp working or flame working.
Thanks, Sally. I think part of the reason why we wanted to ask this question to the group is because, every generation or so, you do see these kind of changes in terminology. And Madeline and I were talking, and we just were wondering if it was maybe time to have a conversation about updating some of the terminology, or at least asking the question to the group. Because it's starting to come up in other areas of the art world. And I think identity is always a valid discussion. And so, yes, this is really interesting to hear what you all have to say. I saw David had his hand up. Are you still, you can re-raise it, David, if you want to.
Thanks.
You
Just
okay.
listening to Sally reminded me something that I thought y'all might find interesting. And that is, I was talking with Dr. Jane a month or something ago, and they were, I had seen that they're taking a job in some kind of space glass on the space station, which, of course, is fascinating. So I was asking some questions about that. And, it turns out it's a very low temperature melting glass that melts at 600 degrees Fahrenheit, which is part of why they can do it on the space station. And, just to me, it was super fascinating. And, I think the term glass covers a broad range of materials that, can be, I guess, accurately defined as glass. So just listening to Sally talk made me think about that, and I thought I would share it. But I do, with my work, if it's borosilicate, I mention it in the description because I work with different types of glass. So just it kind of heads off maybe any questions. If someone asks, I also kind of talk with a lot of flame workers from different areas, so that kind of helps define the process, I think, as well. But those are my thoughts.
Thanks, David. And also, Joe, I just wanted to mention Joe's work in the chat over here. Good point. Joe's got a good point where sometimes being really specific in an identity kind of descriptor that's kind of what forms these kind of cliques or in groups within disciplines. And that might be something that some people want to avoid, or be included in. So, I think sometimes there's sort of this double-edged sword of like, you might want to specialize in some situations, but then describing yourself as having a specialty can also kind of hinder inclusion in some groups. So I think that's a really good point. And, for him, he says it makes him reluctant to pick specifics as an identity. And I think that's absolutely valid too. And I feel the same way when I'm facing the contemporary art world, where I just describe myself as an artist. And if there's follow-up questions on that, I'm happy to open up a discussion, but I don't offer any details because I want my viewers and my colleagues to keep an open mind about my work and about me and about what I'm doing. And I find that that's the best way to do that in that particular situation. All right. Sean, would you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, hi, my name's Sean O'Neill, and I am not a flame worker. So I appreciate that sort of icebreaker from Joe, because I identify, I guess, as a glass maker. I've been working with glass since, I don't know. It's hard to define those early years. I first worked with glass in 1997 at the Crefeld High School, and I'm now part of the 3D Forum at the University of Washington, where we're setting up a flame shop for hopefully 16 stations there in the School of Art building on the quad where David taught this quarter. We had the privilege of having him there. And so it's an interesting conversation to be a party to. And I don't really have anything to add as far as identity regarding flameworking, but I think flameworking is super excited. And I made a little mushroom pendant in 1997 at Crefeld, and I went a completely different direction. It's not that I didn't have the opportunity, but like coming full circle, having blown glass, cast glass, cold worked a lot of glass, taught glass, flame working, I think has a lot of exciting potential for me and in education. And I think coming from the context of being someone who's dedicated myself to the pursuit of glass, and just being aware of the realities of energy use and climate change, I think that more practical applications for the studio artist of glass working, flame working lends itself beautifully to that. And so I'm very excited about that aspect of it. So yeah, that's me. It's nice to meet y'all. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for joining us, and great to hear from you. So I wanted to share too that one time Carrie Fertig came to visit school here, and the way that she described herself was, she said, I'm not a flame worker. She said, I'm an artist who takes advantage of flame working. And that always stuck with me. And I admire her so much as a flame worker, but I also love that she doesn't describe herself in any limiting way by calling herself a flame worker. And instead, I would almost consider flame working to be like the subject matter of a lot of her artwork and a lot of her performances. So it kind of has this like really deep rooted, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here, but for sure that's like a mode of production that she engages in, but to not identify as a flame worker is like really an interesting decision. And I think it helps me keep an open mind for what she's intending for her meaning of her work to be. So I think that works. All right. Would anybody else like to share their thoughts? Paul, would you please unmute yourself and let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Paul Van Bigart. I'm a current grad student at VCU, and I've been working with glass for like 10 years, kind of like hot shop and flame working. I do a bit of both. And for me, like, getting comfortable with flame working has opened up opportunities in the hot shop that I think it's like crosses a lot of territory, and just like being comfortable. I think like torches show up more and more in the hot shop, and like it's a crucial part of my work in the hot shop. But then outside of like my soft glass work, I'm also a pipe maker. So it's a bit of like both worlds, but I do find that there's a bit of a disconnect, that when I talk to some people in academia that like I make pipes, that there still is a bit of a stigma about that, but I also think that is like breaking down. But I find that's like an interesting sort of place of, flame working to me is just like it's a tool. And so it can be utilized in a lot of different processes and not like as defined as like one specific thing.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, at the end of the day, we're really talking about a mode of working. But identity comes into play because there's all of these communities that have kind of popped up in kind of rallying around this particular way of working. And so it's interesting, I think, to talk about the dynamics between those communities. Angie, would you please unmute yourself, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's funny. I think this question kind of comes at like a really poignant time for me, because, I've been kind of thinking about this with my own work. On my Instagram, I have labeled myself as a glass artist because I do primarily work in glass among different mediums, but I really do identify as a flame worker. I think partially because when I was learning how to work with glass, I was working in a place where I had access to flame working, but I was surrounded by hot shop workers. And a lot of those hot shop workers, even a professor that I had when I was at Mass Art, was like, stop flame working, focus on glass blowing. And there's sort of, I think we talked about it in our last meeting. There's sort of an unfair stigma, and we were talking about this earlier, Amy, in class, sort of a stigma against flame workers from other people in the glass community, I think, because people are like, oh, it's tiny glass blowing, not understanding the insane differences and sort of like complexities that can really come in when you're learning technical flame working. But yeah, I've been sort of grappling with this. My work is, I'm adding a lot of different elements to the pieces that I'm working on, and I'm really stepping into the realm of multimedia in a sense. And so even though I sort of identify as a flame worker, my art is not always, just in that realm. So it's really interesting. Yeah, it's funny though. I think when people, when those hot shop workers were like I said, stop flame working, I was like, well, fuck you. I'm going to flame work twice as hard now, So I don't know. Yeah, it's definitely very interesting to think about sort of the way we label ourselves and how we can separate ourselves from other types of artists in that way.
Thanks, Angie. Yeah, I was at a jewelry show. I was showing my work in the contemporary jewelry arena this past week, and one of two, artists who work in glass at all there. And I found myself, when I was getting into dialogue with the audience, talking about bead making, and that's how I started. That's how I started blowing glass and flame working. And still 25 years later, I'm still doing that. And here I am at this jewelry show showing glass beads. And I have all of these other facets of my identity, but that one is very specific. And the reason why I feel okay about self-identifying as a bead maker is because I take a lot of pride in connecting to the history of the bead makers who came before me, the bead makers that I learned from, and the bead makers in the community that I'm in. And so in that case, I kind of, that it really made me think, why one would want to specialize. And in that case, it's to kind of honor those who came before me too. Madeline.
I think just echoing one of Angie's points is for me, part of my identity is sort of this sense of pushback, don't flame working, that's bad, that's less than, or whatever. So I'm like, well, damn, I gotta really own this thing, and it makes me really want to claim it and make it my identity, so I can sort of put it on whatever my terms, or I don't really know. It's sort of this aspect of pushback or struggling, and I think it's also kind of interesting because it sort of in the same vein, and something that was alluded to in the chat, I think by Joe and by Chris, is sort of it really depends on who are you talking to. So I will identify inwardly, flame worker all the way, that's me. And then outwardly, maybe I won't identify in the exact same way. But I think it's sort of interesting because this aspect of maybe you won't be accepted into whatever group you're trying to identify as. Sometimes I identify as I just get on the torch and I fabricate or whatever, but I'm not a fabricate. I don't know. So I think it really depends. There's this sort of ownership, and then also maybe this feeling of oh, do I belong? Do I not belong? So I think it's just such an interesting point people are bringing up.
Thanks, Madeline. Lydia, would you please unmute yourself and let's hear your thoughts?
Oh, shit. Hi, Lydia. I guess I identify as a pipe maker. I learned from hippies in Eugene, and that's entirely my background, what I know. I've been to 2 real art shows. And I make it a point to identify as a pipe maker because, well, apparently I don't look like one. And everyone in the pipe world loves to point it out to me that I look like I'm from from art school. So I really, and also people in the general world do not look at me and go dirty hippie. I mean, a little bit when they smell me, but they don't look at me and go dirty hippie, like glass blower. They're like, oh, art school kid trying to be a wook. And I'm like, no, other way around. So I find that to me personally, I think it's important to identify myself as a pipe maker because there's also a strong struggle or a big struggle in the pipe world to be perceived as female and be identified as a pipe maker at all. So I really think it's important to try to stick to one thing in that particular world and be no, fuck you, I'm here. You know what I mean? So jumping off what Madeline said there too, having that point of identity, if you're trying to be accepted into a certain group, some people really require that you talk about your background and your lineage or how many people away from Bob Snodgrass you're from when you learned. So it's, a thing that you don't necessarily want to do, but you're also forced to do so that people will take you seriously.
Thank you. Sam, did you want to piggyback on that?
Yeah. yeah, just like listening to everybody talking and kind of thinking about like the history of lampworking and like what was it first called and things, and why I would love to feel comfortable just purely identifying as as a pipe maker, and why I hadn't for so long, just openly, and feeling the need, like there's this constant struggle when somebody asks me, oh, what do you do? And there's the like, I want to respect the teachers and the people that came before me and the lineage of lessons that came through pipe making, that then made me into this, what is it, like functional worker, where it like derives from scientific glass, but also lives in this art realm, and it's highly technical, but it's also very expressive. And yeah, it all makes me kind of, and like there's also the limiting, like as a lamp worker or a flame worker, thinking about beads and like the size there, and knowing the potential of this material, and especially how the contemporary pipe world has kind of like pushed the envelope of like color and size and what can really happen, and even people outside of the pipe industry pushing those like limitations, if you will. It seems like the possibilities are like really endless, and I keep coming back, I think, to, I wonder what the original term is for this processes, and like, is that maybe where we should be looking, because we all essentially come from this mother, father kind of practice. Was it lampworking? Was it flame working? Or what was it?
Thanks, Sam. Sally, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what Lydia was saying about not fitting into places. I have never felt I fit in anywhere. You know, I go to the Glass Art Society and they're like, oh, that's the person who does scientific. And I go to the, scientific, oh, there's the person that does artistic. So I never am totally in a group, but that has never mattered to me either. And I'm not sure where the pipe thing got off track, because, the guy who trained me made pipes, and he smoked a pipe all day long. It was vacuum chamber, so it stayed cool all day long while he smoked. And this was inside, right? Like smoking inside a pipe all day long. And then I really don't know what happened, where that became a different thing, because it just seemed like all of a sudden that was shunned. Maybe the government cracking down on marijuana. I don't know, but it has always been part of the American lifestyle. Pipes were made way back when. There's always been pipes, so it shouldn't be a separate culture, I don't think. Just my thought.
Thanks, Sally. And comment from Russ, right on, the war on drugs and DARE. I remember that in the 80s, and that campaign did, I think, have an effect. Oh, before that, David Willis. Yeah, I don't know. That predates my history, but yeah, it would be interesting to learn more about the history. Maybe that could be a topic for a future Flame Affinity Group. So does anybody else have anything? Sean, did you want to, your hands up, did you want to chime in? I think Sean's hand might be up from before. Okay. All right. Does anybody else have any final thoughts on areas of specialty and how we all self-identify before we move on?
I have a thought. It's not about areas of specialty, but relating to the last bit of conversation. My understanding of the American pipe history is that in the 70s, and when people first started selling pipes, in record stores and head shops and stuff like that, mostly started in the 70s or maybe late 60s. But the trade shows and the industry where they would sell all this stuff out was really closely tied to the porn industry, this sex porn industry. So the wholesale events would be together. So the pipes and stuff got associated with the porn, which had maybe an off-color cultural, significance or something like that. So maybe that's where the like pipes are bad thing started. Who knows?
That's so interesting. I've never heard that perspective before. Ooh, now I really want to learn more. Thanks, David. Lydia.
Yeah, age used to be right before or right after the big porn convention in Vegas. Like they would always be scheduled one right after the other. So like all the heady boys are like, yeah, we're gonna meet porn stars. Like, no, you're not. You can't talk to girls. No, you're not. But yeah, the hotels would just always book it together. So that's what I know about it.
Wow, that's so interesting. Thanks. Sally.
Yeah, I started in 1970, and Lloyd, my teacher, Lloyd Moore, was already selling pipes that were fumed. We would fume with red iron oxide, silver, gold, all that stuff. We were in craft shows. And I remember one time a police officer came up. He had a couple hookahs. They were popular back then. And the policeman told him that he couldn't sell the hookahs, but he kept selling the pipes. It's interesting. I didn't know it went with porn. That's new. All right.
Thanks, Sally. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Madeline, who's going to take us through the second half of the meeting. So, Madeline.
Thanks. And thanks everyone for talking. It's so great to get to know you all a little better. And I think one of the amazing things about Flameworking is like, we come from so many different areas in the field. There's so many different like categories or like specialties. So I think the really cool thing is like that we can all come together and have this conversation. So, and the question of identity is one I keep going over my head, like, especially a thing like Lydia said, you like the pipe makers, like, you don't look like a dirty pipe maker or a dirty hippie, like, you don't belong here. It's just so interesting, like you feeling like, identity or lack thereof. So, and representation is so huge. So I love hearing all your stories. Yeah. So kind of segueing off of what we're talking about, and feel free to just keep any thoughts you have, just put them in the chat. Really anything, there's no wrong answers to anything here, by the way. This is a totally judgment-free zone, totally safe space. Just to let you guys know that. So kind of thinking about that is like, now that we're kind of like together as a group, what are ways that we can like define ourselves collectively in the field? And sort of one question for that is like, how do we define, like, what is contemporary flameworking? So many people might be familiar with Bandhu Dunham's book called The Contemporary Lampworking, which is a reference point. And that's a great book. So it's kind of a point of reference, but what is lampworking? What is flameworking today? How is it different from the past? What is and what is not contemporary lampworking? Does that question even mean anything to some people? Is it irrelevant to some people? So I'm really fascinated to hear people's thoughts, if they have any thoughts about that. And kind of what we're getting at here is like, is there a way we can come up with language or like, this definition where everyone is included, where the pipe makers, the jewelry people, the weirdos in their basements, the people who just dabble in flameworking, like we can all be included in whatever language. So I'm really interested if anyone has any thoughts. And, for me, I think like one aspect of contemporary lampworking is like, I see there's a lot more collaboration happening nowadays, more and more than ever. So I think that's huge. And there's this like portability in flameworking where we can kind of, we can go back to our kind of itinerant roots and, go travel and do demos wherever. But it's a little bit more, we don't necessarily need to be in a studio. And yeah, I'm curious if anyone else has any thoughts. Amy, yes, please.
Yeah, so just kind of taking that term, contemporary flameworking, to me, contemporary in the contemporary art world generally means living artists. And so, and then flameworking to me refers to like a mode of working, a technique. And so, as far as I'm concerned, contemporary flameworking, when I use that term, would be a very inclusive term to mean anybody who is working, who's living now, making work now, and using a mode of working that involves basically the way I kind of define flame working is using torches to melt glass from room temperature up, and of course that's not, meaning like our glass is not coming from a furnace. Typically it's coming from, rod or cane that's pulled or tubing and cold. So that's typically how I understand like flame working as opposed to other modes of glass working. Although, of course, there's exceptions to all of that. But in general, I think I could consider, hobbyists, and then, specialists, like we talked about, scientific glass blowers, pipe makers, bead makers, sculptors, all the way through to artists who might choose to use mode of flame working in their contemporary art as well. I would consider to be included in that kind of contemporary flame worker kind of overhead. So I see it as like a very inclusive term, and I would feel okay about using that term contemporary flameworking to talk about kind of all of these subgroups at large, including myself.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree that I think it's pretty inclusive personally. And like something that feels like to me is like, there we have like really deep specialties for some of us, and then there's also maybe, and I'm curious if people agree, like there's more like cross-pollination or kind of like a lack of being categorized, or kind of it could be different. You can belong in different categories at once, like fine art, craft, science and art at the same time, kind of like ephemeral work or commodity. Yeah, I see Joe said in the chat, if you use a torch to manipulate glass in any part of creating a work, that work is tied to contemporary flameworking. Absolutely. Jim Wan Han says, I think the contemporary flameworking is more concept driven. I think that's a great like point that it could be potentially. Yeah, I agree. I love seeing like the conceptually driven work. Angie.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think, I agree with like what Amy said. I love that. I like that idea of keeping it, the definition of it as inclusive as possible. But I also think another big part about, talking about what's going on in contemporary flameworking, a lot of that conversation, you can't talk about it without talking about borosilicate glass. I think it was Robert Mickelson posted a piece either today or yesterday, a piece that he made in like the 1980s. And what I thought was really cool about the caption was that he was like, these two colors, ruby and sapphire, like a red and a blue, were the only colors that were available to them back then. And, I hear that a lot of the time from people that, have taught me and given me lessons and stuff like, oh, you guys are so lucky nowadays. The Boro color palette is huge. And yeah, I'm sure Sally can give us more information about that. But I think a big part about contemporary flameworking is, this expansion in the borosilicate color palette that is happening. And I think that when you look at a lot of work, whether it's by pipe makers or people who are just making sculpture, the work right now is a lot more colorful because of the new colors that are constantly being made and adding to the palette, or being added to the palette. So yeah.
Thanks, Angie. I think that's a great point that like now we have more colors or tools or things at our disposal, and that could heavily influence what contemporary flame working or lamp working is. Sally, do you have something to add to that?
We had blue and uranium green, and everything else we mixed ourselves. And it was always ugly. I remember giving away my big bag of chromium saying, oh, thank God I'm rid of that. I don't have to mix that anymore. So yeah, you guys are so lucky. And then somebody earlier in the chat said, oh, you can fume with red iron oxide. Yeah, you get this really kind of nice, kind of reddish, goldish color with red iron oxide. So there's a lot of other things that you can fume with. But yeah, it just amazes me the color that is out there now. I remember Paul Troutman sent me a red to try. He goes, Sally, try this color out. And I heated it up and it turned clear. And I'm like, oh my God, I melted out all the red. And I was really worried. And I called him up and I said, Paul, I'm so sorry. I destroyed your red. I melted it all out and it's clear. And he goes, just put it in the oven, Sally. So there was a lot of learning curve there. And, Sue Ellen Fowle and Paul Troutman really gave us our background on color.
Thanks, Sally. I'm like every day, I'm just thankful I don't have to mix my own color. It's a beautiful thing. Chris, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just listening to a lot of everyone's story and, kind of coming, like when I started flame working and, Amy being my teacher, there was like this like playfulness to it that I didn't really see in like the hot shop or a lot of the other practices. And I think like the contemporary flame working, it has like the ability to merge kind of like glass in general, because like Sally had mentioned, like you have kind of like this ability to like take different like types of glass and really see, like watch them melt and see what happens, like the reactions. You can't really do that in other practices. You can't do that with like a pipe and, with the glory hole. Doing it with like fusing and having like a window, viewing a window is different from like putting it up to the torch and watching it immediately cool and things like that. And I think like this whole concept of contemporary flame working, it really like that, just like what Amy had said and what Joe had said, it opens up like this whole like experience in genre of melting glass is like the take that I'm getting from like just listening to everyone's story and then just my experience. It's kind of the only time I get to like R&D stuff, and there's really no other like other practices that allows me to do that. And I think it's continuing growing. I think it's gonna, like, as more advancement happens, as more research happens, more glass is just going to keep coming out, and then we're going to start discovering more properties in flame working, or contemporary flame working or whatever, has the ability to kind of tap into that, because that's like from that ground level you can kind of like hand, eye, see, observe the reactions that are actually happening compared to a lot of other practices. That makes any sense.
Totally. Thanks, Chris. I think like the color conversation is so interesting because like it seems like a really recent and important thing and an important aspect of flame working. And for me, at least, like I feel like there's always new colors coming out, and I can't keep up with them. And I'm like, what is all this? And it's like each one has its own learning curve. And I'm kind of curious about, like, I don't really know how to like crystallize this thought, but like color with borosilicate and flame working is like it's such a part of like recent flame working. But then like if you look at like, I don't know if you guys have like looked at like New Glass Review or like, sort of like these publications that are like, this is new glass. Like it's often like really clear, or like there's not a lot of like color. And like, or like it feels like more like academic glass, like in art schools and stuff. Like there's not a lot of color, and it's almost like color seen as like, I don't know, something like, is there like a color versus clear hierarchy there? Or Angie?
Yeah, well, just that that comment made me think of, I don't know if you guys, if anyone's familiar with Zach Weinberg's work, but Zach Weinberg actually, when I was a student at MassArt, he had been working on a piece where he cataloged all of the work in the New Glass Review and made an Excel spreadsheet so he could look at the data. And he was able to get these different data points, like what type of glass work is most likely to get into the New Glass Review, what color glass work is most likely to get into the New Glass Review, and also what's not most likely to get in the New Glass Review. And so that after he collected all that data, he then went through and he submitted 2 different pieces to the New Glass Review, one under his actual name and one under a pseudonym. And he actually did, one of the pieces was all of those points that were more likely to get into the New Glass Review, and then all of the points that were least likely to get into the New Glass Review. So each piece, he was kind of like trying to cheat the system, basically. And it was just really interesting. But yeah, that, you know, one of the things that I took away from it that I kind of was like, this kind of goes back to that discrimination that flame workers face, is that flame working was least likely to end up, other than art made with found glass, flame working was like least likely to get into the New Glass Review, and kiln casting and was the most likely to get in. And then I think it was hot glass after that. But yeah, it was just, I don't know, that when I was in school, that information really stuck with me. And I think it goes back to sort of what I think, you know, some people kind of echoed before, is that just like going against the grain, you know, when you know, flame workers are getting shit on, and I'm like, well, I'm going to keep going for it. I'm going to fucking flame work 10 times as hard, you know, I don't know.
That is fascinating, Angie. Thank you for telling us about that. Do you know if it worked, that project?
Yeah, so it's actually funny. I think the piece that he submitted under a pseudonym, going for all the things that were most likely to get you into the New Glass Review, that piece did not get in. But that year, his like own original artwork got in, which it was funny because the whole reason he like did the process collecting all those data points was because he had tried to get into New Glass Review for so long and couldn't get in. And then that one year, like his work actually got accepted. It was very funny, the presentation, for sure.
That's really cool. And I think I remember one year, a few years back, there was like tons of pipes in New Glass Review, like, because I think one of the judges, I forget exactly who it was, but I think maybe Micah was one of the judges or something. Anyway, it's so interesting because, like, of course, that all has to do with who's like on the jury for that. But I guess one follow-up question I have, just like a really basic one for the group, is like, flame working versus lamp working. I just tend towards using flame working, but I try to use them interchangeably. And I'm curious if anyone has any like opinions about which word they prefer, or, you know, sometimes I call myself a flamer, which is, you know, whatever, that's like a little more descriptive, or torch working. So, yeah, does anyone have any thoughts about that? Sally, I know you use lamp working, I believe. And I think I remember you telling me there was a reason.
Yeah, I use lamp working when it's kind of appropriate, like for the glass flower exhibit that we have at the Fuller Museum, you know, that's associated with, you know, the glass flowers at the Harvard Museum. Lamp working was then used. And so throughout that exhibit, I used lamp working. Yeah, I still think that titles, just get rid of them all. You know, yeah.
I like that perspective. Lydia, what do you think?
I've heard people say that it differs by coast. Like people on the East Coast say lamp working, and people on the East Coast say lamp working, and people on the West Coast say flame working more. But that's all I got.
Interesting. Ben.
I have a small aside where I know that there was a point where you could use soft glass stringers and literally use like a lamp, like a candle with a little light on it, and that temperature would be low enough where you could just work really slowly and carefully just with like a really tiny amount of heat. So I'm curious if that scale of heat is like a term that we want to keep using.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And like similar to what David said in the chat, like we say lamp working, people think we make lamps, which is kind of funny. And like some people being drawn to the word lamp working because it has like such a history, which is so cool. But then also like, does it mean like, is it, I don't know, does it not reflect what we do as much? Does it not matter? This is just, semantics, but I think for me, it's a very fascinating question to know why people use which. Yes, the oil lamp torch is super cool. That was recreated. So that's kind of why I use them interchangeably. But I don't know. I think it's so interesting. So while we stew on that question, I'll just move forward to kind of my last sort of area of inquiry for the group, which is like, where do we think flame working is headed? Do we think it's going anywhere? What do we think that there's a specific trajectory or future, or what is the way that we want to see flame working going? And the goal for this is trying to identify potentially some goals for us as a group and a community that could be actionable. So sort of part A to the question is like, in what way do you see the field going? Do you anticipate advancement in the field of flame working or lamp working? And part B is like, what is advancement in the field? I mean, we chose the word advancement because it's so broad, like it could mean so many different things to different people. So I'm kind of curious, like, to hear like any kind of answer to that. Is it more flame workers out there, or more, do we want to be recognized? If there's this hierarchy in place, like flame workers at the bottom, hotshot people on top, like, do we want to be on a different level with the hotshot people? Or do we not want to even, like, does that not even matter to us? I'm kind of like, I'm not really sure. I go back and forth. But like one of my personal goals for flame working for advancement is increased visibility for flame working. So more people being exposed to it, showing the different aspects, that we're not just one thing, that we're all sorts of different things with different areas of specialty, and more representation of flame working, like at conferences or, just in general in the world, in the art world. Amy, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think that I have personally many goals for the future of flame working, but one thing that I think I'd like to mention here is that borosilicate, as we've mentioned, is a relatively new type of glass to be working with, and because of all the advancements that have happened in the last, I would say, couple of decades that were really accelerated by the popularity of pipe making. I think that borosilicate really is starting to be explored by sculptors sort of outside the glass world. And I would really like to see where that goes. I think there's so much potential there for large scale, for editing, for repairing, for kind of taking the glass apart and putting it together in a different way. And there's all of these, it's almost like there's a different logic that can be used to think about glass as a plastic material that, when you're working with soda lime glass, there are some restrictions on what you can do with it, as far as like what I was just talking about, like editing and repairing and like heating the piece back up and reworking it and stuff like that. And so I would really like to see kind of people outside the glass world and what they can do with the material. And then also from within the glass world, how we can really push the material to behave as a plastic material and in a mixed media sense as well. So I'm really excited, and I would consider that to be kind of like an advancement, like a major advancement for the visibility of flameworking, but also technically to really push that material in the way that in the 20th century furnace glass was pushed during the studio glass movement.
Totally. Thank you. Angie.
Yeah. Something that I've really gained a new appreciation for after completing the scientific glass program at Salem. For those of you guys who don't know, I got a bachelor's in fine arts at Mass Art, and then recently after that went down to Salem. And seeing scientific glass has made me think about glass itself in a new way. I really think all the time about how our society is entirely dependent on these advancements in glass technology that advance medicine, technology, all sorts of things. And so I think scientific glass workers are really taking us into a new era. Someone actually said that, they say that we're in the glass age now. Because of, like I said, how dependent we are on these certain technologies. I mean, we're all talking to each other over devices that have glass screens and stuff like that. So, probably sharing this information over a high-speed internet connection that's made with fiber optic cables. So I think flameworking and glass itself have a big role in not just where we're going as in an artistic medium, but where society is going. And that's something that I've been really trying to consider in my own art. And, the past few months, really taking those skills that I learned in scientific glass in order to influence and take my art in a more technical direction. So I think flameworking really has a lot of possibilities for where it could go. And I think it's going a lot of places for sure.
Thanks, Angie. And I think that's also sort of a great point that you brought up, that scientific glass blowing itself is also so responsible for so many advancements, not just in flameworking, but in science, like that we have scientific glass blowing to thank for so much. So that's really fascinating. Chris, I think you're next.
Let me see. All right, sorry. Investments. So I'm gonna in my world, I've been able to have some very interesting, problems presented to me in glass, and I think a lot of flameworking would have. I think flameworking was like the start of it, but maybe not the full answer, but definitely like the start of it. One was when I was interning at Corning in the Innovation Center, he was a retired naval officer, and he was down in Boca Raton, something like that. But he presented me with a problem of fusing like a broken fiber optic and splicing them together. And we're talking, we're trying to reach temperatures, 900 degrees Fahrenheit and super small. And he was like, if you can figure out how you could do this and do it on scale and just kind of present it, he was like, you'll have a job. And he was like, here's my number, here's my information. I talked to the committee. I'll talk to the committee and, you'll have a job. And it kind of got me to think whoa, okay, this is like, how do I, fiber optics, we know you can bend it. It's super small. How do you even do that? And that was kind of like the first light bulb going off in my head And then last year, we're sitting at work, and we're making. So I was making $4 million glass drones out of Gorilla Glass, ranging anywhere from 1.1 millimeters to 0.55 for DARPA and aerospace. And our first few that we made when we won the DARPA competition, they were we fused them together. Like the wings were like fused together using adhesive. But for the second version, we had to consider like, okay, no more adhesives. It's got to be aerodynamic. We don't want like this, like just tacky glue. It's not a solid fix. And it also affects the tempering process that we did. So we were considering doing, which is like considered like laser welding, but it's done in a vacuum. So you would have to create a box that has actually a vacuum, and this torch, which now has become so precise, it's like a laser. And you would have to, like, obviously, because it's in a vacuum, you have gloves. So it's kind of like, think about a sandblasting box that's vacuumed, and then a torch that's inside. And then you're like making like these laser welds at precision. And, you know, with this, depending on the laser, you variate the temperatures depending on the glass. But that was something, you know, like Flameworking would go towards, because you couldn't just be some, you know, mechanical engineering being like, oh, let me like, you know, do this. Even though a lot of those contracts, they're getting the shot at it. It's not the artist. It's not the contemporary flame worker. It's me trying to like talk these PhDs on like, hey, we could go this route, but because you don't have this, you know, this hierarchy of things, your ideas kind of get shot down. That's why I'd love to see like Salem, you know, go 4-year and work on things like that, because that's something like a flame worker, whether it's the fiber optics or the Gorilla Glass infusing, those are kind of things that can be done on a precision torch. I mean, they're not out yet, but you know, it would be like a torch type of situation, because trying to slump and fuse at that tolerance, trust me, it's almost like you don't even want to do it. It's really hard. And then currently, at Thermo Fisher Scientific, I just got a gig with Bruce Suba, but we're doing glasses fusing to tungsten, Colbar glass, and it's used for like X-ray devices. So that's another thing, is like where Amy was saying like bigger scale, like maybe like I'm really found to like architecture. So you think about like these big architectural buildings, you know, like skyscrapers, and then if you can get that glass to now like, you know, you're not building like window frames. You're just able to like literally like kind of have the material of the skyscraper and the glass kind of meet up, and then you could just kind of like laser weld that, and it would fuse, and you don't have to go through the flames, and then you could have like different shapes. You could then like start taking slump shapes that are more curved and really having like these really organic shapes applied to architecture. But it would have to be, like I said, the way you would fuse it would be a good way to through like flame working and laser welding and things like that. So I definitely see in my everyday the potential of what flame working where it can go and how it can be applied. I think it's going to take a lot of innovation, a lot of like third party companies out like GTT and other people to kind of come up with these new concepts and figuring out ways to do it. And also like, you know, providing the new glass that's coming out. A lot of the stuff we don't have. We can't just like, you know, go to Mountain Glass and just have it shipped to our house in 2 days. But I definitely am excited about what's to come. And I think, you know, flame working, like I said before, is kind of like that foundation skill that kind of kicks off to like, you know, building houses on Mars and shit like that. For sure.
That's so cool. Thanks, Chris. That does sound like fun. Goldie, would love to hear from you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Goldie. I'm new here. Sorry, that's why I was kind of nervous to speak. I have a contemporary art background and fine art background. And I work a lot with borosilicate. Where I'm from, I'm originally from the Philippines, and I wanted to bring that up because I feel like I would love to see the contemporary flame working industry, or whatever it will be identified as in the future, move towards the realm of expansion in the developing world. I went to art school in the Philippines, and we didn't have glass in our program. And I went to like one of the pioneering art schools from my country. And I feel like in the Philippines, though, there are scientific glassblowers. And that's how I got drawn into flameworking. Was I was working on my thesis, and I wanted to work with glass, but I had no access to glass. And so I found out that the chemistry department at my university had a scientific glassblower who would fix all the equipment. And I think that there is potential for flame working to expand, I guess, or to be more accessible to people who otherwise wouldn't have that chance. I definitely am excited also about like the plastic potential of the medium, because like we've discussed, the color palette is amazing. There's the potential to edit and to fix things, so that's exciting. And to create parts that, you know, can fit together, not necessarily in ways that, you know, I feel like hot shop glass can, since there's like a lot of potential in the medium. But I would just love to see more of an international expansion and inclusive, since we're talking about inclusivity, you know, to include people that want to work in glass that otherwise would not have that access. Because first of all, hot shop glass is so expensive. It is virtually, well, it's not impossible to have it in third world countries, but then it's very, very difficult. And I started with glass, I feel, at a later time in my life, that I feel like, you know, expanding contemporary flame working would be also expanding glass for people who otherwise would not have access to glass at all. So I guess that's just where I would like to see that go in the future, and what I'm excited about. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Goldie. It's great to see you, by the way. Thanks for coming tonight. I think that was really well said. I agree. And I think that, like, you know, that's one really big part of like flameworking is like it could be accessible to so many people who can't access hot glass in other ways. So I personally see flameworking as like the new frontier of hot glass. Like, and when we can no longer, you know, heat the hot shops and keep them running with all the cost to the environment and all of that, like I think flameworking could be the thing that we sort of turn to for now. And I think just touching on just a couple things that people said on the chat is like, I think Joe and Alyssa said it, like more interdisciplinary work, incorporating flame working with other things, other components, other disciplines in media. I think like I would love to see that. Like it doesn't have to just be like confined to just flame working in a box, but like can we use flame working with other work? And I would love to see like flame working in more like biennials and, you know, international shows. Like, sorry, my cat wants to say hi. And what about like flame working being like represented without like needing to call it out as flame working? And I think that it's kind of interesting where it's like, well, right now I'm at the point where I want to see like more representation for flame working. Like we have to like grab onto this identity, but maybe like eventually, like we don't even need to identify it. It's just art, you know? So like, why do we need to have labels? Yeah. Okay. Paul, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was going to quickly say something about that. I think like it's really interesting, kind of like the state of flame working, and also like the state of the popularity of pipe making, and that's influence on the younger generation. And I think a lot of people like coming into institutions and stuff like that, they're that's like their initial drive a lot of times. Like sometimes they're like, oh, I'm going to go here, I'm going to learn how to make pipes and bongs and stuff like that. And then they're like shut down from that. But I think a way to like integrate more is like think about the technical aspects of pipes and how they can be integrated in facilities, almost like a scientific sort of approach that's applicable to the interests of a younger generation. I think that's like a really good way to kind of like merge interests and focus on technical ability and like design. I mean, there's so many aspects to pipes that I feel like it's applicable to. It's like a common ground for a lot of flame workers that they can kind of like come together on like a similar sort of subject matter. And it can be used to give students skills that are applicable to like multiple different things. So like, I'd like to see pipes be more open in institutions, but not necessarily in the sense of like, oh, you're just really allowed to make pipes. It's also use it as like a basis to like challenge design, technical ability, like a lot of different components. And that's kind of where I see it like fitting into academia.
So almost like pipes as like a technical or conceptual exercise or something?
It can be considered that way. And that, I mean, I guess that's a way you can also like gauge a student's interest, because a lot of the times they're like, oh, I want to make a pipe, and then they make a pipe, they smoke out of it, and then that's fine. But it's like, if they really are interested in the material aspects, you can use that as an in to engage their creativity. Be like, okay, how are you going to decipher this pipe from what's imported? And if you're not going to decipher it from what's imported, how are you going to make it faster? How are you going to improve the efficiency? How are you going to like challenge those things, you know? So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that it's important to recognize that like pipe making is an entryway into glass for a lot of people. That's their entry point. And so like, why should we try to fight that or stifle that? Thanks, Paul. Bill, what are you thinking?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to say, based off what Paul just said, I'm like brand new to glass. I just bought a torch in April, and I bought it because I wanted to get into pipe making. And then I fell in love with glass, and I'm taking a class with Madeline right now, and I'm making like sculptures, and like I'm really loving it. And yeah, I just wanted to put in the 2 cents where like pipes was like my interest to begin with. But now it's so little of what I do. I like make a lot of pendants, and like I just make so much different stuff because it's like such a versatile thing. I just did my first vending event last week, and people were asking me like, hey, like how'd you get into it, stuff like that. And I was just like, oh, it was a hobby originally, and then I fell in love, and now I'm trying to make it a career. I'm going to Salem for scientific right now. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say, like, the pipes is definitely, like, an entryway, but there's definitely so much more to glass where it's, like, I don't know, it's just, like, such a multi-versatile, like, so much you can do with it. The pipes is, like, definitely an entry point, but it's definitely not, like, where I think I'm going to stay.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that, Bill. I think it's really great to hear from like students and people who are just starting out, because it's really cool to hear the different perspectives. And I think that it's like, yeah, it totally is an entry point for some people. And if you make pipes forever, that's great. And if you leap and do everything, do science, do art and pipes or whatever, that's also great. And I also kind of think that like once like if we like take away the stigma of pipe making, like we take away like the taboo nature or whatever, like then maybe people are going to be like, oh, like it's like less of a big deal. And then you can make pipes, that's great. If you don't have to, that's also fine. So like, you know, now with legalization, we can just sort of as educators or as whatever, we can just be like, no, it's like whatever, it's part of class. You can do that. You don't have to. So it's very interesting. Ben asked a question for me as a figure using Flameworking on TikTok. Do I see a younger generation / my audience making the leap into the material? That's an interesting question. I get like tens of people every week being like, hey, how do I get started in this? How do I blah, blah, blah. So I definitely have like given people information, told them about Salem, told them about like places where I teach, and like linked to the resource exchange to be like, okay, you want to set up, like, here's a link to that to learn everything you need to know, and just tell them like take a class. So it's kind of interesting, like that being its own entryway, because I think everyone has their own different entryway into glass, whether it's like you saw someone working in the Renaissance Fair, or you have always loved like functional art, you thought that was so cool, or you just saw someone online, you're like, oh, it looks fun. Let's see, Alyssa says, I've been forced into pipe making, but would love to never have to make one again. If there was a market for jewelry, if there's a market for jewelry, I make the way my pipes are consumed. That's a great point. That's so interesting. It's sort of like we have to follow the market, be able to sustain ourselves here. Yeah, very interesting points. Thanks, Alyssa. Great. Is there anything else anyone wants to say? Or is there anything, if someone hasn't gotten a chance to speak, and you just want to like say anything about whether it's something we touched on earlier or not, I'd love to hear from you, to give you a chance to talk. This is a really open discussion, so just feel free to chime in if you want. And kind of a follow-up to this question about like advancement and how can we become more actionable. Well, one thing I think, just as a side note for advancement in the field, is increased dialogue between flame workers. So that's one thing we're doing right here, right now. Like, we're from all different aspects of flame working all over the country, and like we're actually coming together to talk. And something I haven't had for so long, I'm usually just by myself in my studio, like texting someone once in a while. So are you leaving? Bye, Sally. Thanks for coming. So I think like that's one thing where I'm like, great, like we are starting to talk. Like it's amazing to get to chat with all of you at different walks of life. So I think that's super cool. So, what would future action look like? And another question I want to pose to the group, if you have thoughts, is are there any topics that you want to discuss in future meetings? Like what kind of issues are relevant to you that you may not have, like that you want to hear from other flame workers? If if there's any topics you want to talk about, or you'd like to like pose to the group, just feel free to type them in the chat or bring them up, or you can always just message me or Amy anytime if something comes up to your mind, because we'd love to we've got some ideas for more future conversations, but we'd love to hear from the group, because this is a group dynamic. This is, kind of like a opportunity for dialogue where we're all equal. Everyone's voice is equally important, and there's no hierarchy here. So that's why I'm just so lucky to get the chance to talk to you all. And I think, on that note, I'm gonna, let's see. The field really needs to have a deep dive discussion on increasing diversities in all areas. Exactly. I think that's really true. Agreed.
I'm just going to hop in here for a sec and just add that the reason why we wanted to kind of throw it out to the group about what are some topics that you might be interested in kind of diving into are because Madeline and I are in the planning stages for our next meetings in the spring. And so we'd love to kind of crowdsource what we're doing here, So I think that's a really good idea, Joe. The field really needs to have a deep dive discussion on increasing diversity in all areas. And I think that could be a topic all in itself. And we definitely kind of dove into that at the last meeting. And I think we could absolutely revisit that. Another thing that would be interesting to know, maybe for the future, or maybe if you have any ideas to put in the chat, are, we're having dialogue now, but at some point, might some action come out of this group? And if so, what could that even look like? So that's just kind of something to keep in mind as we're having these discussions, maybe there are some possibilities of like having some action that might come out of this that might increase visibility for flame working or increase diversity, or maybe there's some ways that we could use the group to kind of foster this type of dialogue.
Absolutely. Paul, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, just in terms of like maybe future content or something like that, it could be talking about like collaboration and like what sort of platforms to use, and potentially, connecting people from different aspects, whether that's like neon or jewelry or pipes, or, you can kind of like cross-pollinate that way. And if there's like some way that we could like build a platform or utilize a platform to like brainstorm or like kind of connect and share ideas, I think that could be cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's definitely something I was sort of like leaning to, is like this conversation of collaboration and new ways of, like, I love that your point is like new ways of doing it, and cross-pollinating. So thank you for that. And this idea of like, accessibility and diversity, I mean, that came, thanks, Chris. Thanks for coming. That came up a lot in our last conversation, and as we go through our notes, we're kind of mulling over like what kind of action can we take moving forward, and it's something that is stewing a little bit, but we're figuring out like what steps forward for us as a group. So we're figuring that out, and we're very open to ideas, comments, suggestions from everybody. So. Just know that you can always reach out to us. We use there's like that chat on the Google group that we're using, and it's kind of like a casual thing where it doesn't need to be super formal. You can just throw your ideas out there, and this is just like a really it's like an open group where no idea is really wrong, because everyone has their own like valid perspective and stuff. And on that note, I think I'm going to pass it back to Amy to give our kind of closing little remarks here.
Thanks, Madeline. Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I would like to hear more from the pipe makers. Mm-hmm. So I think we could even do a deep dive to kind of get some of the stories and the voices and the history and the traditions kind of imported into the community, because I don't think that their perspective is heard enough, so I think that could be a topic. But on that note, hold on, we're gonna let Lydia. All right, Lydia, tap in. Hi.
Yeah, what glass gossip you want to know?
Well, you know what?
That's it. That's the whole joke.
No, not gossip so much, but like some of the things I'd be interested in knowing are like just the way that teaching happens in the community. And then there's also a competition aspect too. And I would just be interested in knowing more about some of the structures that the pipe makers have come up with in response to not being able to access institutions, because I think there's some solutions there that could be kind of like maybe adopted to help solve other problems. So I just think that there's some really innovative solutions that the pipe makers have come up with and built structures outside of the traditional institutions that I'd like to know more about. And yeah. So on that note, to be continued, please. And let's see. Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you all. I think that this gives us a lot of ideas for planning future programming. So you can look forward to that. And I just want to thank you all again so much for another long meeting of like riveting discussion. So thank you all so much for taking some time out of your evening tonight to join us and to contribute. We appreciate you all. And we will be back in the spring with the next meeting, which will happen early spring. And we will let you know. You can look out on social media and we will send you messages about that so that you'll know when that's at to kind of join in. So thanks so much and have a good night, everybody.
Hey, this is Emily from GEEX, aka the Glass Education Exchange. GEEX is an online platform connecting people and sharing materials in the collective field of glass education. That's a bit of a mouthful. So what does it actually mean? GEEX creates supportive spaces outside of traditional academic structures to offer community-building programming and resources. Programs like the Flame Affinity Group offer a space for constructive dialogue between practitioners in the field. We're hoping to nudge the field of glass into its next generation through new models of community support. This recording is also available through one of our initiatives, the Glass Resource Exchange. The Glass Resource Exchange is a user-contributed library collecting and sharing educational material like articles, supply lists, videos, and more. We're hoping to see it grow as a common resource, supporting glass teaching and learning. Want to support GEEX? Small donations really help us continue building our communal programming. Alternatively, you can subscribe to our lecture series, featuring outstanding glass artists and researchers. Learn more at geeks.glass/support. Thanks for watching. Want updates on new GEEX programs and resources? Follow @GeeksGlass on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, or visit our website, geeks.glass. Thanks again, and stay tuned.